And now we'll take today's virtual event forward with the presentation on global regulation and AOAC program on food fraud by Dr. Bert Popping from AOAC. Before going ahead, I would like to tell you all something about Mr. Bert Popping. Bert Popping is working for 25 plus years in leading, including C-level positions in global food testing companies. As well as in government, he was responsible for analytical method development with customer needs and economic aspects as key drivers, but also managed knowledge transfer and marketing company in one of the global laboratory networks. Based on his broad experience, his perspectives are holistic. Current activities of Bert includes development of food safety strategies for FBOS, know-how support of laboratories and TIC investors, supporting government in capacity building, activities on national and international committees like CEN TC 275 and TC 460, German Government Analytical Methods WG, USP FIEC and USP Fraud WG. Bert serves on the Board of Directors of AOAC International, on the Board of MoniQA as President, AOAC Food Fraud TF as Scientific Advisor, ILSI Food Fraud TF as Co-Chair, Editorial Board J Food AgriCont J Food Analytical Methods, co-editor of Encyclopedia Style book Present Knowledge in Food Safety. So can we please have Dr. Bert Popping, Managing Director of Food Consulting Strategically.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bert Popping. I'm with Focus Food Consulting Strategically, which is an international food safety consulting company. As we're talking about food fraud today, I will also share with you that I'm the scientific advisor to the Food Fraud Task Force of AOAC. In medieval times, food fraud drew draconian penalties. On the left-hand image, you can see the city of Nuremberg, and in medieval times, if a person adulterated saffron was convicted of the crime, that person was burned at stake. Now, the death penalty was abolished in Europe a long time ago, and the penalties for food crime are less harsh these days. And sometimes you wonder if they are not harsh enough, because food fraud still pays, often even if you get caught. And the many cases we saw essentially support that food fraud still is a big business. After the numerous incidents with fish, meat, milk, cheese, and many other foods, regulators implemented additional legislation that also now require food manufacturers to take a much closer look at what goods they are receiving and where from. So in the United States, for example, Barack Obama signed the Food Safety Modernization Act into law in 2011, also known as FSMA. And the core rule of this legislation included specific requirements for economically motivated adulteration, also known as food fraud. Now, the rule requires that several aspects must be fulfilled. Manufacturers must produce to good manufacturing practice. They must perform a hazard analysis and implement risk-based preventive controls for human foods. Similar to the US, Europe also implemented the Consumer Information Regulation in 2011, and that has the number 1169, so the regulation number is 1169/2011. Food fraud is often a gray area. Was an ingredient, especially a cheaper one, replaced accidentally, in which case it would not constitute food fraud, or has it been done deliberately and with full intention, in which case It is for economic gain and it constitutes food fraud. Now, the European Commission identified 4 criteria that would allow the differentiation between an accidental incident and intentional, i.e. food fraud. So those criteria correspond to the rules currently in place in the member states to report food fraud. Number 1 is the violation of European Union rules. And that basically entails the violation of one or more rules codified in the European agri-food chain legislation, especially that one referred to in the EU Regulation 2017-625. Now, 625, that regulation in Europe is also known as Official Control Regulation. It's actually one of the more interesting regulations, as for the first time, the competent authorities are required to identify if there is suspicion of food fraud and then follow up on it. Now, the second point is the deception of customers or consumers. The criterion entails some form of deception of the customer. For example, if a product has altered coloring or altered label, which essentially mystify the true quality or, in the worst case scenario, even the nature of a product. And in addition, the deceptive element may also come in form of a public health risk, as some real properties of the product are hidden. For example, if an undeclared allergen has been added to the product. And the third element is basically the act that brings some form of either direct or indirect economic advantage for the perpetrator. So one example could be a grey market production. And the fourth criterion we already discussed previously, it's basically the intention. And this criterion can be verified through a number of factors which give strong grounds to believe that certain non-compliances are not happening just by chance or by accident, such as the replacement of a higher quality ingredient with a lower quality one. So far we've been talking about public law, the regulation that everybody has to abide by. Now we're jumping to the private law. And the private law in this context are schemes like BRC, the British Retail Consortium, IFS, SQF, and some others. They are organized under the umbrella of GFSI, the Global Food Safety Initiative. And since especially Europe saw a number of food fraud cases with high publicity level, Horsemeat 2013 to name just one, the schemes made food fraud risk assessment a core aspect for food manufacturers, so they have to look at their risk assessment for food fraud. In the context of food fraud, this is called vulnerability assessment. So as such, it requires you to look where your ingredients are coming from. Is the country high on the CPI, the Corruption Perception Index? It also requires you to look at which form your ingredient has. A raw material, for example, can often be identified visually as authentic, while a ground material no longer can. So let's take an example at pepper. So just before we talk about the pepper, just a heads up that on the next slide I'm going to show you, I have a QR code. So if you're interested to follow me to their website, you may want to get your phones out now. Anyway, on the left-hand side of the picture, you can see the whole pepper corns. It's easily to visually identify them. You can see the peppercorns, and you might even be able, if you have a trained eye, you might even be able to detect if some much cheaper papaya seeds have been commingled with them. But if you look at the right side, you see it ground, so you would not be able to determine by just using your vision if the cheaper papaya seeds have been mixed with the pepper. So this is like with a QR code if you want to get your phones out. Now, what you see here is basically a scheme that has been worked out by the volunteers of the USP, the volunteers of the United States Pharmacopoeia Convention, to screen for such vulnerabilities. This is taken from an article that we published in the IFT magazine. And as I said, if you scan the QR code, it will take you to the article. It's an open access article. So while manufacturer implemented tighter controls through electronic and paper documentation, how would they know if their product is adulterated. We have a saying here that says paper is patient, and it basically means that paper does not complain if incorrect information is printed, for example, the wrong specification, and we're going to look at that a little closer. And this is where Corona comes into play. So prior to Corona, you had ample opportunity to basically identify potential vulnerabilities and remedy problems through the audits and inspection that took place at different parts along the food supply chain. But now, in times of Corona, many of those audits and inspection can no longer take place. So the control can essentially often only be done during the intake of the raw material, which places the entire load on the producer to ensure that the food is safe and up to standards. So this is really where the analytical part comes in, and while paper documentation is very important, it is the food analyst that has to demonstrate that the product is as described in the product specification and is not adulterated. And here comes the problem. Let's just take a look at how many adulterants there are. So here you see three different products: olive oil, milk, and minced meat. So have a guess how many known, and the emphasis here is really on known adulterants, exist for olive oil. Is it 5? Is it 10? Let me give you the answer. It's 52 known adulterants for olive oil. There are 78 known adulterants for meat. And for milk, there are as many as 163 known adulterants. And most of these analytes are actually detected using so-called targeted methods. These methods only look for those analytes that they were made to detect. So if you have a method for melamine, it will detect melamine, but it may not detect the addition of urea. And of course, the known adulterants are only the tip of the iceberg. What about all the unknown adulterants that we haven't found yet? And even if we take the example of melamine in milk, it's just one of 163 adulterants that are known. So the cost of testing for all 163 known, let alone the unknown adulterants, would just be so enormous that it couldn't be done. It's not feasible economically. So this is where analysts have devised a completely new strategy. So instead of looking for a handful of known adulterants, while there are many more, they have devised a strategy called non-targeted analysis. There is a synonym, it's called untargeted analysis. And basically, instead of looking for individual adulterants, you check in the entire profile of a substance. So you could check, for example, the profile of dried milk powder. If there is any abnormality, and that is shown in the middle, the blue line there, where you have the peak outside of that turquoise range, that might be an indication for an adulterant. You may not know exactly what that adulterant is, but you can clearly see that is a deviation from the normal profile of reference material that would be held in the database and that the unknown sample would be compared against. And you can see that the untargeted methods or non-targeted method have really picked up a lot of speed. The number of manuscripts that you can find now in PubMed has grown almost exponentially. So if you search for non-targeted or untargeted, you find by now more than 9,000 manuscripts that have been published. So how would an analyst be able to differentiate which is a suitable method to deploy in his or her laboratory and which one isn't? So the essential question of the method's fitness for purpose has to be asked, and it's impossible for most analysts to assess all 9,000 plus methods. So there has to be a concept how the fitness for purpose can be easily and quickly assessed. So how would you go about? How would you determine which methods are useful and which criteria such methods should fulfill? How would you develop such non-targeted methods? Now, personally, my first port of call would be, are there any international standards out there? This is one of the major challenges. It takes a fairly long time to develop an international standard. We've seen that at CEN, the European Standardization Committee, and certainly we've also seen that with ISO. So those standards are extremely useful once they exist, but it takes such a long time until they are in place. And the world still rotates during that time. That means that there has to be an interim, a faster solution, an easier solution. And this is where SMPRs come in. So what are SMPRs? SMPR is short for Standard Method Performance Requirement. It's basically a concept that has been developed by AOAC International, and it documents a community's analytical needs for certain methods, in this case the food fraud method. It's a very detailed description of the analytical requirements. It includes method acceptance requirements, so that's a guidance for users if the methods are useful, fit for purpose or not. And it used to adopt AOAC official methods by expert review panels. And then they're published in the OMA, the official methods of AOAC, in the Journal of AOAC International. So AOAC has basically established a task force for food fraud with a remit of developing SMPRs, Standard Method Performance Requirements, for relevant commodities. And we have two subgroups formed. One is for the non-targeted method, and that's breaking entirely new ground because we are not aware of any standardization organization that has taken on non-targeted method or performance criteria for non-targeted method. And the second group is basically looking at existing or newly formed targeted methods. The groups identified 3 commodities that were the first step to be looked at: milk, honey, and olive oil, for reasons, for example, the frequency of adulteration in such commodities, but also often because of the number of adulteration in such commodities. So both groups have essentially worked with experts from around the world. So an expert committee was assembled and they worked to devise criteria for such methods. And for both the targeted food chemistry methods and the non-targeted food chemistry methods, each of the group has devised 3 SMPRs for methods, one for honey, one for milk, one for AVO in each of the 2, the targeted and the non-targeted group. So all 6 SMPRs, the 3 from the targeted group and the 3 from the non-targeted group, have been voted and accepted by the community and are being published in the Journal of AOAC. But now, what are the next steps? So if you remember, so far we have the 2 groups and they're both basically looking at chemistry method. What we haven't actually looked at is DNA-based methods. And DNA-based methods are particularly handy when it comes to adulteration with different species. So one of the more recent examples is oregano, where oregano was adulterated with olive tree leaves. Now, DNA technology, PCR, next generation sequencing, can very easily distinguish if there are other species present. The same thing when you have, for example, a product that's supposed to be halal. It's very easy to use DNA technologies to test if there is pork meat present or not. So again, 2 groups were formed, one for the targeted technologies, so where you have for example, a real-time PCR specific to pork meat or specific to olive tree leaves, and a so-called non-targeted technology where you use next-generation sequencing and basically are able to identify any species that could have used to adulterate a specific product. And we've looked at the type of methodology to detect adulteration, and we've also now expanded the commodity range. So the next range the group is looking at will be spices and botanicals. So here you see the 2-dimensional roadmap. So we are expanding into the area of molecular technologies, the targeted and the non-targeted. as well as expanding the matrix range, the spices and the botanicals, but they will not only be looked at from the DNA perspective, they will also be looked at from the food chemistry targeted and non-targeted perspective. So the leaders of those groups will also be developing SMPRs for spices and botanicals. So here you have the three leaders of the group. So for food chemistry, the targeted technologies, it's Joe Boyson, a consultant. For the food chemistry technologies, the non-targeted one, we have John Spilker from the Food Safety Network. And for the targeted as well as the non-targeted technologies, we have Danielle Soyer from Thermo Fisher. And if you are interested to work with us to contribute to developing the SMPRs for spices, botanicals, either food chemistry or molecular technologies, do get in touch either with Joe, John, or Danielle, and you would be very welcome to work with us on devising those SMPRs. I would like to thank you for listening. If you have any questions, you can reach me at info@focus-food.com, so info@focus-food.com. And I would like to leave you with a picture of our beautiful village, which is very close to Frankfurt. So once we can resume traveling, if you have a layover in Frankfurt, don't miss out. Take a detour to Alzenau, which is in Bavaria, but just across the border from Hesse. It's a beautiful place with a beautiful castle, so stop by if you have the time. Goodbye for now.